I'm willing to bet that pretty much everyone has heard of the term Templar. It's this guy, and this guy, and these guys. The name Templar brings to mind all kinds of tropes which have been repurposed again and again. Sometimes it's fighting with religious zeal, sometimes it's holding esoteric secrets, and sometimes it's both. But beyond these more abstract ideas, the kinds that have inspired an entire industry of books, as well as several revival groups, the Templars were also a real historical organization, a medieval religious order of warrior monks, permanent crusaders, who actually had quite a big and interesting impact on medieval Europe and the Levant, at least until their rather dramatic downfall, which continues to intrigue people to this day. This is going to be one of two videos I plan on making on the Templars. In this one, I'm going to be talking about the real historical order, who they were, where they came from, what they did, and what happened to them. You know, the sort of things I typically talk about on this channel, being a medieval history education channel. In the next video, I'll be talking about something that's kind of hard to avoid whenever you talk about the Templars, and that's why are there so many Templar conspiracy theories? I'm sure the comments on that one will be interesting. But today we're focusing on medieval history, so without further ado, let's go back in time to the early 12th century. The First Crusade ended in 1099 with surprising success. The Christian armies had managed to conquer a great deal of land in the Levant, the area of the eastern Mediterranean coast, including the holy city of Jerusalem. The Crusaders were thought of as warrior pilgrims, traveling east to secure what they saw as the Holy Land for Christendom, and to make it safe for other pilgrims traveling to these sacred places. Now, most Crusaders returned home after 1099, but the newly founded Crusader states were still vulnerable, as were the unarmed pilgrims arriving in greater numbers, especially as they traveled across vast open roads to get to locations like the Jordan River, several days away from Jerusalem. At the same time, some pilgrims began devoting themselves to churches in the Holy Land, especially the Church of the Holy Sepulchre built atop the tomb of Jesus, and stayed there long term. Enter Hugh de Pin, Geoffrey de Saint-Omer, and a handful of other French knights who came to Jerusalem in the early 1100s. Although there are several accounts which differ slightly on the details, what's clear is that these men wanted to devote themselves to a religious life in Jerusalem. Rather than simply live as traditional canons or monks, however, either the king of Jerusalem or the patriarch, depending on the version of the story, realized that these knights could serve God and Christendom in a different manner, by devoting themselves to the protection of pilgrims and the defense of the new kingdom of Jerusalem. The king gave them lodgings in his palace, the Al-Aqsa Mosque on the Temple Mount, where the old Temple of Solomon had once stood. The mosque itself was often referred to as the Temple, and so this would eventually give them their name: the Poor Fellow Soldiers of Christ and the Temple of Solomon, often simply abbreviated to Templars, Knights Templar, Templar Knights, Knights of the Temple, or sometimes just the Temple. This took place around 1118 or 19, but the order would be officially recognized at the Council of Troyes in 1129, where it received papal approval and got its first formalized rule. For those unfamiliar, a rule is a set of, rules that a religious order must follow. And for the Templars, this included the three vows which were coming to be central to most religious orders: chastity, personal poverty, and obedience. With a rule, the Templars were officially monks, just like the Benedictines and the newly formed order of Cistercians. Now, there is a slight issue here in that clerics and members of religious orders were traditionally not supposed to take up arms. Monks were supposed to be pacifists, and yet the Templars were also knights. This was actually one of the biggest criticisms leveled against the Templars in their own time. Some people saw them as a paradox, hypocrites, and even an obstacle to the mission to spread the faith by evangelization to all corners of the earth. But most people seem to have been on board. In fact, one of the most famous and influential men of the day, the Cistercian poster boy Bernard of Clairvaux, wrote in praise of the Templars, and may have been a big reason for their approval at Troyes. Bernard stressed that the Templars were true monks in their day-to-day lives, living just as austerely and piously as any other order. They prayed, feasted communally, and were never idle, and they only took up arms when absolutely necessary to defend Christendom. His portrayal is idealized, of course, but it shows how a man respected for his religious authority could reconcile the seeming contradiction of a military religious order. In fact, people had been describing monks as warriors for a long time. As Christianity had been integrated into cultures where martial prowess was seen as central to elite masculinity, those who took vows which prevented them from fighting physically were perceived as spiritual warriors, fighting the devil with their prayers, fighting for the salvation of the secular laity as soldiers in God's army. The Templars, then, were taking up both spiritual and physical warfare on behalf of God and Christendom, which is what their supporters admired. But Templars weren't really monks taking up arms, they were knights taking the cloth. As knighthood as a concept developed in the century leading up to the creation of the order, so did the concept of chivalry, the vision of what the idealized knight should be. Piety and religious devotion, as well as charity and protection for the weak and vulnerable, were all seen as characteristics of the ideal knight. The ideal knight was also a man who would romantically pursue a lady and likely end up married with kids, so not quite a professed religious. But there was overlap, and the Templar order fit into the space of convergence between the monastic and chivalric ideals. Those knights who took the pious devotion aspect of idealized knighthood most seriously found their place amongst the Templars. It should be no wonder, then, that there are plenty of Templars in medieval Romance literature and epic poetry. They were often seen as the epitome of the pious knight, and were certainly the inspiration behind the Templeisen who guard the Holy Grail in the 13th century German poem Parzival. On the other hand, we also have several stories of lovesick knights running off to the Holy Land to join the order after the romantic interest married another man. Other military religious orders would also pop up later, taking inspiration from the Templars. Some, especially in the Iberian Peninsula, were knightly orders from the start, though they tended to be smaller. Others, like the Hospitallers and the Teutonic Knights, started out as caretakers for the sick and poor at hospitals in the Holy Land, and eventually gained the additional role of defending Christendom. Bernard of Clairvault's contemporary, the Cluniac monk Peter the Venerable, called the Templars monks by virtue and knights by deed. But what did that entail? What was life like as a Templar? Well, as I just noted, they were monks, and they were expected to live like monks. This means they lived a simple and austere communal lifestyle in convents, called commanderies, and prayed the divine office every day. Of course, that's easier to do when you're a Benedictine monk living your entire life in a cloister. Templars were often on the move, especially in the East, so simply reciting a few Our Fathers was sometimes considered enough. As noted before, they also took the triple vows of chastity, poverty, and obedience. This means no relationships with women. Sorry, James Purefoy and Ironclad. And also Dante in the Dante's Inferno video game, who is a Templar for some reason, and apparently married to Beatrice. It also means no personal possessions, with everything you use belonging to the order as a whole, and it means absolute obedience to your superiors in the order. And speaking of superiors, every commandery had its own commander, who was the equivalent of a prior or an abbot. The commandery's knights regularly met in meetings called the chapter, and in order for a new member to join a commandery, they needed to have the unanimous approval of its chapter. Regionally, commanderies were organized into provinces, each with their own provincial master, or grand commander, and eventually his approval would also be needed for new members to join a commandery in his province. In some cases, provinces could be grouped under another master as well, but at the very top of it all was the Grand Master of the Order, who was based first at the Temple in Jerusalem, and then at Acre after Jerusalem's fall in 1187. The Grand Master was subject only to the Pope, and had final authority on matters within the order, though there was an expectation that he would rule with the consent of his brothers, especially his own convent, which most of them did. But grand chapter meetings which assembled commanders from far and wide were mostly really advisory councils, with all power stemming from the Grand Master and his convent. Grand Masters were appointed for life at a special chapter attended by the knights serving in the East. Now, the Templars existed to defend and secure the Holy Land, but there were commanderies all over Europe. Most Templars joined the order through a commandery close to home, after which many would head east, often quite young, in order to serve in the Holy Land. Then, after several years, a knight might go back west and eventually serve as a commander, with them moving around from commandery to commandery every few years as they held various offices, possibly going back and forth from east to west. The historian Alan Forey suggests that this, quote, possibly helped to reduce the likelihood of tension within a house, and to emphasize that offices were a responsibility rather than a reward. Still, some spent their entire careers in either the East or the West. There was no one-size-fits-all career path, and it largely depended on circumstances as well as your social class. Like much of the rest of the medieval world, the Templar order was stratified. There were 3 categories of members of the order: knights, sergeants, and priests. Knights are the ones that we typically think of when we imagine Templars. They wore the classic white mantles with the red cross. In fact, although all members wore the red cross, only knights were allowed to wear white, the only exception being priests who became bishops. The rest wore black or brown mantles, meant to clearly differentiate them. The knights were the most prestigious and the ones in charge. In order to be a Templar knight, you had to be the legitimate son of a knight or other nobleman. The vast majority of commanders and other high office holders were knights, and for the most part, only knights took part in the chapter meetings. There were also secular knights serving temporarily with the order, but they weren't full members, and the Templars also employed squires, who were likewise not full members, though both had to take certain temporary vows and live a semi-monastic lifestyle for the duration of their service. Sergeants were the most numerous in the order, and they could come from any social class as long as they were free, so no serfs or slaves. They performed all kinds of jobs, either as sergeants at arms, fighting alongside the knights, or sergeants at service, who might be merchants, artisans, accountants, administrators, or even simple laborers. Some could end up as commanders, but even sergeants in high positions were expected to defer to knights if they were present. Sergeants with administrative educations tended to fill most administrative roles in the West, and were more likely to spend their entire careers without ever stepping foot overseas. And finally, there's the priests. While the knights and sergeants were famous for their beards, something quite rare amongst Catholic churchmen, Templar priests were more like typical clergy. They served as chaplains and as parish priests at Templar churches, though Templar priests were never all that numerous, and many, if not most, of their churches employed priests appointed by the local bishop. One thing that was rather atypical, though, was the position of the priests in the order. The Templar rule explicitly notes that the knights are in charge, and the order's priests are subservient to them. This was at a time when it was more and more common for most monks to be ordained as priests, and for priest monks to be in charge of their lay brothers. But the primarily military nature of the Templars, combined with the fact that ordained clergy were forbidden from bearing arms, meant that knights could not be priests, but the knights still ought to be in charge. This gave them more authority than even the knights of other military religious orders like the Hospitallers, whose mission wasn't as singularly military in nature. The Templars were a military order, though their fighting was mostly done on the frontiers of Christendom. While a commandery in Europe could be a small house with somewhere between 3 and 20 brothers, those in the Levant and Iberia could be whole castles with hundreds of Templars. From their castles, the Templars were expected to protect the Crusader states in the east and the Spanish kingdoms in Iberia, protect them from raids, and even perform raids of their own into enemy lands. The Templars would end up with a fairly large number of castles, and were important political players in the Levant, making alliances and negotiating peace deals. But they were also not the primary rulers in these regions, nor were they the main armies of Christian kings. They were supplemental, assisting the kings of Jerusalem and Iberia in their wars whenever they were needed, or joining in major crusades whenever they were called. The Templars could be military advisors, but they were rarely the ones calling the shots. But their help was invaluable. Both Christian and Muslim sources state that the Templars were some of the best, fiercest, most disciplined, and bravest soldiers they'd ever seen, and facing a Templar cavalry charge would have been no joke. It was said that they were always the last to retreat, since they were forbidden to flee as long as their standard was still up. and even if it did fall, they were expected to join the ranks of other military orders if they could. Because of this, however, they also suffered high casualties whenever a Crusader army was defeated, especially as they often stood back to protect others as they fled. Their boldness could also get them into trouble, like for example at the Battle of Ascalon in 1153. The Templars exploited a breach in the city's walls and fought their way inside, but because the rest of King Baldwin's army hesitated to follow them in, they were surrounded and defeated. They were also often blamed whenever things went wrong, even when it wasn't really their fault. This was in part scapegoating, but the Templar historian Helen Nicholson also suggests that their reputation as warriors was so great that defeat seemed like it could only be possible because of their own mistakes. However, the defense of Christendom didn't only entail combat. Diplomacy was just as important, and the Templars often served as mediators and negotiators to end and sometimes even prevent wars altogether. They helped establish truces and alliances with various Muslim rulers, and were even considered by some of them to be friends. This diplomatic element even extended to relationships with Christian rulers, both on the fringes of the Christian world and at its center. Many courts had Templar courtiers, representing the order, sure, but also serving various roles within the government, and playing the same diplomatic role that they did in the East. Although they tried to avoid taking part in inter-Christian conflicts, their participation was sometimes inevitable, especially when it came to questions of succession in the Kingdom of Jerusalem, with the order, for example, supporting the ascension of Guy de Lusignan to the throne rather than Raymond of Tripoli in 1186, and later supporting Charles of Anjou over Hugh III of Cyprus in the 1270s. There was also an economic element to the Templars' activities. The Templars were essentially a full-time standing army in an era where that was incredibly rare in Europe. They needed to supply their fighting brothers with arms and horses. In fact, their lack of resources early on is why on their seal you see 2 knights sharing a single horse. They also had to build and maintain dozens of castles as well as ships, and they had to clothe and feed their members and pay all kinds of employees, from cooks to dairymaids to mercenaries to help increase their numbers in battle. In short, the Templars needed money, constantly, and in the Middle Ages that mostly meant land and primary resources. Luckily, since they were a religious order, they received plenty of donations from pious individuals and anyone who wanted to see their mission of defending the Holy Land succeed. The Templars received estates across Europe, which would be managed by the local commanderies, over which they would act as any other feudal lord. They also received direct monetary donations, and they used parts of this and the profits from their existing lands to purchase more, expanding their resource base. But of course, the point of all this was to support the effort in the East. So each province was expected to send around a third of its profits to the Holy Land, with the exception of the Spanish and Portuguese provinces, who sent less since they were also maintaining castles and occasionally fighting Muslims. The scale at which the Templars were collecting and moving wealth across the Mediterranean was something rarely seen at the time, and it led to the development of a sophisticated system of accounting. It also made the Templars into, essentially, an early bank. In fact, they had such a good reputation for keeping money secure that their commanderies were frequently used for the safe deposit of money, gemstones, and even livestock. And their network of houses across Europe meant that merchants and other travelers could feel safe depositing money with them and withdrawing an equivalent amount somewhere else. Something that seems so obvious for us today, but wasn't always possible. It sure as hell beat taking all your money with you and losing it in a shipwreck or getting it stolen by highwaymen. Some Templar houses became so important for depositing money that even rulers started to use them too. This was most significant in France, where throughout most of the 13th century, the temple in Paris was the royal treasury, and the royal treasurer was a Templar, with Templars serving as accountants and maintaining the king's finances. The kings of England also used the temple in London for part of their treasury, and so did the kings of Aragon, Cyprus, and Portugal, though to lesser extents. The Templars also issued loans, but these weren't quite like the loans you'd get from a modern bank. Usury, that is, loaning with interest, was considered a sin, but there were exceptions, mostly around compensation for not paying the loan back on time. And this usually amounted to something like a one-time fine or the seizure of whatever had been put up as collateral. Sometimes the profits from an estate would be granted to the lender until the borrower had paid them back in full, but all in all, loans weren't very profitable, and they weren't central to the Templars' economic activities. In fact, many of the Templar loans were more charitable than economic, not expecting any compensation as long as it was paid off. Indeed, the Templars, as with other religious orders, were also important providers of charity. They distributed alms to the poor, sometimes from their own means, sometimes from donations, and even provided them leftover food and clothing. There are also references to the Templars giving hospitality to travelers, though this was probably not as extensive as with the Hospitallers, for whom this was kind of their whole thing. But as I said before, service to the poor and needy was an important part of both the religious and chivalric ideals. The whole idea of defending Christendom and protecting pilgrims was meant to be a form of charity. And although these other, we might say more typical forms of charity were not their main purpose, the Templars still took them seriously. And charity was just one of the ways in which the Templars were tightly woven with the world around them. As I've noted before, they were diplomats and courtiers, deeply involved in the politics of the regions where they had a presence. They were also landlords, just as involved in the lives of those living on their estates as any landlords would be, collecting rents, upholding the law, organizing fairs and markets, and providing various services. And they were important employers. Again, as I noted earlier, they hired all sorts of employees, some of whom would have lived in their houses with them, or at least in close proximity, sharing meals with them, and at some of their European properties, the Templar houses were inhabited exclusively by these employees, without any full members of the order living there full time. Some of these people were hired seasonally, like farmhands during harvest, while others were long-term and permanent. The Templars even provided pensions and lodgings to some of their employees who got too old to continue working for them, as well as for certain donors. All of this has led Helen Nicholson to note that the arrest and dissolution of the Templars, which in England was accompanied by massive cuts in the expenses of most commanderies, would have been a major blow to the laborers of the local communities and their families. And these ties weren't exclusive to Europe either, nor to European Christians. Although the Templars did support some colonies in the Levant, most of their lands over there were inhabited by the local indigenous population, many of whom were not Christians. And contrary to the imaginary depiction that some of today's Templar fanboys might glorify, the Templars generally didn't have any issue working with or employing Muslims. And the same goes for Jews, especially in Iberia. In general, they actually had a much milder and less passionate view towards the quote-unquote Saracen enemy than a lot of the preachers of the Crusade back in Europe, though that sentiment could, of course, ebb and flow depending on the context and the individual. But still, their goal was to protect Christendom, not to convert by the sword nor to exterminate Islam. The fact that they lived on the fringes of the Christian world, often surrounded by non-Christians, made them much more familiar with the other than most. And as long as local Muslims, or even neighboring Muslim leaders, weren't seen as a threat to Christendom, they could very much be friends. I think the perfect illustration of this comes from the writings of the Muslim poet and courtier Usama ibn Munqidh. In a biographical anecdote from his time in Crusader Jerusalem around 1140, he writes the following, quote, "Everyone who is a fresh emigrant from the Frankish lands is ruder in character than those who have become acclimatized and have held long association with the Muslims. Here's an illustration of their rude character. Whenever I visited Jerusalem, I always entered the Aqsa Mosque, beside which stood a small mosque which the Franks had converted into a church. When I used to enter the Aqsa Mosque, which was occupied by the Templars, who were my friends, the Templars would evacuate the little adjoining mosque so that I might pray in it. One day I entered this mosque, repeating the first formula, Allah is great, and stood up in the act of praying, upon which one of the Franks rushed on me, got hold of me, and turned my face eastward, saying, 'This is the way you should pray.' A group of Templars hastened to him, seized him, and repelled him from me. I resumed my prayer. The same man, while the others were otherwise busy, rushed once more on me and turned my face eastward, saying, 'This is the way you should pray.' The Templars again came into him and expelled him. They apologized to me, saying, 'This is a stranger who's only recently arrived from the land of the Franks, and he's never before seen anyone praying except eastward.' Thereupon I said to myself, I've had enough prayer. So I went out and have ever been surprised at the conduct of this devil of a man, at the change in the color of his face, his trembling, and his sentiment at the sight of one praying towards the Qibla. Although Ibn Munkith here is focused on the rudeness of the newly arrived Frank, the way he contrasts it with the attitude of his friends, the Templars, is striking. But of course, the Crusader states would not last forever, and numerous defeats would gradually cause the Templars and others to lose their lands in the Levant, with the final loss being at Acre in 1291. Despite this, the order continued to operate from their new base in Cyprus, and business remained mostly as usual in Europe. That is, of course, until 1307. At this point, the Pope was Clement V, and rather than ruling in Rome, his court was in Avignon, right on the border with France, whose king, Philippe the Fair, had a great deal of influence. After rumors had begun circulating that the Templars were engaged in certain heretical practices, the Pope asked Philip to investigate. But the king took this as an opportunity to arrest all Templars within the kingdom, to confiscate their possessions, and to aggressively extract confessions of their guilt. Clement was initially rather pissed about this, but he also couldn't ignore the confessions, and so he told the rest of the kings of Europe to do the same. This was the beginning of the end. The Templars were accused of denying Christ, spitting on the cross, worshipping an idol, sexual depravity, and corruption. But with the exception of those who were strong supporters of the kings of France in the 14th century, most people were, and are, doubtful about the legitimacy of most of these claims, or at least that they were widespread, a few blasphemers and gay knights aside. But the king used extensive torture to get the confessions he wanted. Now, I won't go in depth here into the complexities of the use of torture in medieval law, but suffice it to say that it was typically not used to this extent. We know now that torture is actually a terrible method of getting the truth. The recipient is more likely to say whatever they think will relieve them of that torture, even if it means a false confession, and they'll sometimes even invent incriminating details that weren't even asked for. People in the Middle Ages were also aware that false confessions were an issue and tried to limit torture to circumstances where guilt was almost certain. But between the liberal use of torture, leading questions, confirmation bias, selective recording of testimonies, and strategies of targeting the weakest members, Philip managed to make it seem like their guilt was undeniable. Outside of France, however, the situation was rather different. Torture was a lot more limited here, and confessions were incredibly few. Church leaders, although they may or may not have believed in the guilt of the French Templars, didn't find a whole lot of damning evidence in their own lands. The Archbishop of Mainz even acquitted the order in his archdiocese, though Pope Clement struck that judgment, saying the archbishop didn't have the authority to make that decision. In any case, the trial dragged on, stopping and going for the next 5 years, until 1312. Despite the situation in France, the evidence for the guilt of the order as a whole was inconclusive. Nonetheless, at the Council of Vienne, Pope Clement declared that the reputation of the Templars had been so irreparably damaged by the whole affair that they would be dissolved, and their possessions transferred to the Hospitallers. For the most part, brothers who had been found innocent or who had renounced their heresy were allowed to continue living in their old commanderies, or some of them transferred to different orders. Many were even given a pension to live off of. Others actually renounced their religious life and went back home to their families, even though that was technically not allowed. And some even managed to get back the property which they'd given to the order. For a few, though, especially in France, things ended less well. A number of Templars had been burned at the stake by King Philip during the trials for supposedly being recalcitrant heretics. This usually translated to those who denied earlier confessions made under torture and defended the order against the accusations. The most famous instance of this was actually after the trials had ended, with the last Grand Master of the Order, Jacques de Molay, renouncing his earlier confession and being burned at the stake in 1314 alongside Geoffrey de Charnay, while 2 other high-status Templars were imprisoned for life. So then, if these accusations weren't true, why did this happen? Well, people have been debating that very question since the 14th century. One rather popular argument is economic. The Templars had a lot of money, something they were occasionally criticized for, and Philip the Fair was deeply in debt. His foreign wars and projection of power helped solidify France's position as the foremost power in Europe, but it was also very costly. He debased the French currency multiple times and seized wealth from the Lombard lords in 1292 and the French Jews in 1306. He may have been hoping to do the same with the Templars, who he may have also owed some money. Although their possessions were ultimately granted through the Hospitallers, there was no guarantee that this was going to be the outcome, and he might have hoped that he could at least keep some of it. Never one to let an opportunity pass him by, however, Philippe refused to give France's Templar lands to the Hospitallers until they paid him back a debt of 200,000 livres tournois, which the Templars supposedly owed him. It's also possible that the wealth of the Templars might have been something which enticed the rulers of other kingdoms, even as they were not entirely convinced of the Templars' actual guilt. Edward II of England, for example, who'd already once seized money from the temple in London, an event which had at the time caused riots in the city, was deeply strapped for cash, and he took revenues from the Templars' estates in England for the duration of the trial. And once those properties were ordered transferred over to the Hospitallers, he refused to do so until the Pope agreed to grant him a loan. But were these economic factors the reason for the trials in the first place, or were they just royal opportunism? Others have pointed to the fact that after 1291, the Templars had seemingly lost their purpose. While the Hospitallers captured Rhodes and the Teutonic Order shifted to fighting pagans in the Baltic, the Templars had failed in their task of defending the Holy Land. This isn't to say that the Templars weren't doing anything. As we've seen, they had a lot going on, and they continued to be quite impactful to their local communities. But still, their reputation had definitely taken a serious hit, and the piety of their mission alone wasn't enough to defend them anymore. They may have become an outlet for people's frustrations and fears, and corruption does seem to have been a genuine issue, one which people likely had less and less patience for. That other accusations might be tacked on to that in rumors and whispers is not too far-fetched. But Philippe's reaction does seem to be a little extreme if that were the case, and as with most things in history, the reality is likely a complex mix of both. What this whole situation shows, though, is just how much the Templars relied on good relations with kings in order to maintain their position. Although they were officially independent from secular and even local church authority, the reality is that they made a great effort to keep things smooth. And at the best times, this meant a great deal of privileges and even royal grants. But when that goodwill was no longer there, and when kings realized that getting rid of the Templars benefited them more than their continued presence, they were extremely vulnerable. The Templar order, and really military religious orders in general, are a fascinating part of medieval history. They were involved in every aspect of the medieval world: the religious, the secular, the economic, the social, the cultural, the geopolitical, and, of course, the military. I find it a bit of a shame that the mythology that's been built up around them has tended to overshadow their genuinely interesting place in history, and I hope that I've been able to help rectify that in some small way. With all that said, that mythology is genuinely interesting in its own right as well, which is why I'll be devoting my next video to it. But anyway, with that, I, of course, thank you all so much for watching. Be sure to check out the sources and other recommendations in the video's description, and I will see you next time.